Hello and welcome everyone. I am Liz, your host here on Crimes Untold, and today we're going to be discussing the unidentified serial killer of the Jeff Davis 8. So this is a series of unsolved homicides that happened along the Jefferson Davis Parish. So your thoughts on that? We're going to Louisiana today. Anywho, so this span of crimes happened between 2005 and 2009, which is a similar span between our previous video of the Rainbow Maniac, and that happened between 2007 and 2008. So basically it's encapsulating our last video of their timeline. So the bodies of these victims of the Jefferson Davis 8 were found within the swamps and canals or in different parts of Jennings in the parish. So it's due to a very vast state of decomposition. The cause of death of many of these victims couldn't fully be determined, although it is believed that 5 of the victims had died due to asphyxia, 2 died due to having their throats cut, and 1 ultimately is undetermined. But all of this is basically a justified summation about what they believe happened, because due to the state of their bodies, them being in water, being surrounded by water and wildlife, it's kind of hard to ultimately determine what exactly happened to them. Let's just kind of jump into these victims, shall we? Our first victim is Loretta Lynn Chason Lewis. She was 28 years old, and she was a young mother who had been missing for about 3 days before her extremely decomposed body was found in the Grand Marais Canal by a local fisherman on May 20th of 2005. So at first, when he was on this canal, he thought that this was a mannequin, but he found it kind of odd because there was flies being attracted to it. When you see flies, that ain't no mannequin. No. So he would end up, going over and realizing it's a body. He then would inform the police that he found a body. At first, it was determined that she was heavily intoxicated by alcohol, and there was trace evidence of drug paraphernalia or drugs in her system at the time of her death, which then was caused by asphyxia. This was simply just written off as she died because of drugs and alcohol. A next body would be found. So we found one in May, on May 30th. Our next one would be found in June. It's not very long between each of these victims that we're finding these bodies. So our next victim was determined to be Ernestine Patterson. So Ernestine was found to have trace evidence of drugs in her system at the time of her death. She was found about 6 miles away from Loretta Lewis's body, in the same canal, basically, but 6 miles away. Interesting. And our second body to have been found with trace evidence of drugs. Very interesting. There would be a break in time between victim 2 and victim 3, but it wouldn't make swallowing this pill of these women dying any easier. Oh no. So the next body would be that of Kristen Lopez. Kristen Lopez was discovered when she was found on March 18th of 2007. I told you, quite a gap in between these victims. So we have 2005 to 2007, which, like I discussed in my previous video, when there is gaps in time between victims, something happened. Based on who they believe perpetrated this, it is possible why there would be a gap in time. But that is something for the way after we talk about these victims. Way after. So Kristen Lopez was known to be intellectually challenged, and she had even participated in the Special Olympics prior to her leading a life of being a sex worker in order to fuel her drug addiction, unfortunately. It is reported by her friends that she became increasingly paranoid leading up to her death and leading up to her murder, which is very sad. But paranoia often comes with drug addiction. There is, to this day, a plain wooden cross in the same spot where her body was discovered, and you can still see it. There is a plain wooden cross there to this day. On May 12th of 2007, Jamie Trahan found a woman's body that would be naked and was beaten on the side of the road. Now, Jamie Trahan was a local informant for the Jennings Police Department, and the woman that he found was in fact deceased. This was the body of Whitney Dubois. The bruising on her determined that she died an extremely violent death, and her cause of death is listed as being assumed as asphyxia. She was found the day before Mother's Day. which is unfortunate because she left behind her small child, which I'll kind of talk about also in a little bit. Laconia Brown was last seen on May 27th of 2007. Her body would be found and her cause of death was determined to be caused by a slit throat. There is no physical evidence that was found at the scene of her crime. Absolutely none, unfortunately. In September of 2008, Crystal Zeno would be found in a drainage canal. Her body was badly decomposed. She turned to drugs as a teenager in order to help her bipolar disorder, and this unfortunately would plague her the rest of her life until she succumbed to her demise. Brittany Gary would be last seen walking to the dollar store on November 2nd of 2008. You see, Brittany had just moved back to Jennings, and she was on edge because she knew most of the victims had died recently. Most of these women she knew, which is very sad. And what made it even worse is that November 2nd was the last time she was seen, and her body would be found 2 weeks later. She was badly decomposed, and her cause of death was listed as assumed asphyxia. Nicole Guillory was determined to be our final victim, who was a local prostitute. Worked with the police, and the police would confirm that she was the final victim. Nicole Guillory was found off of the I-10 in 2009. So there's a lot of things that kind of tie our victims together. So Brittany Gary knew a lot of them. Ernestine and Laconia, or Ernestine and Muggy, as Laconia was found, they were the least decomposed bodies out of the 8. Their cause of death ultimately would be determined, would be due to their throats being slit. And then we have Kristen, Whitney, Crystal, Brittany, and Nicole. These 5 were determined to have died due to asphyxia. So it's during the investigation that a man named Ethan Brown, he's an investigative reporter, he would dive deeply into this case. And the only reason why I'm bringing him up is because he is the one that figured out the connections between these victims. That they were connected in more ways than one. They didn't just have a drug background. They didn't just have a prostitution background or a sex work background. They weren't just all from Jennings. They weren't just all friends. They all worked with the police. They were an informant of some sort. That was the common denominator. And they were also highly known by the police prior to being an informant for their history of drug use, dealing with mental illness, living in a poverty-stricken lifestyle, and turning to sex work in order to help make ends meet. And it's also the relationship that the police had with these women was also something that made the police force at the time come under fire. And this is because of how they used them as informants. You see, they used these girls as informants in the drug trading in the area. So they would see it firsthand, they would report back, and they would be told, okay, go back, get me more information. Basically kind of being used as a mule, but not being the mule in a sense of smuggling the drugs in. You know what I mean? They're just kind of like that, which I know that's how informants work. Nobody come at me. I know this is how informants work, but it's just really sad to read that they were just being used and abused by these police officers in order for them to score. You know what? Like, it just sucks because you know that as soon as they do their task at hand, they're going to receive more drugs. They do the task at hand, more drugs. They do the task at hand, all right, it's time for you to die. Like, they're just going to cut their losses and be like, all right, my hands are clean. I don't have to do any of this anymore. You know what I mean? It's just kind of sad because they're human too. They don't deserve the injustice that they've been given at all. All of these girls have been served so unjustly. And I'm not the only one that believes that. Oh no, you think the rabbit hole of Reddit is bad for the Rainbow Maniac. This one is worse. And all the people that live in Louisiana around Jennings, man, they're so, like, there's a Facebook group that I am a part of, and somebody put up a thing about one of the documentaries about this and said that it's wild. So I just commented on it that I would be covering it because I knew I was. Each month I pre-pick cases and I try to go off of a topic. There will be some months where I don't have a topic and I'm just going to cover things, but this was one of the cases that I knew in December I wanted to cover for March. So I put it on there that I was covering it. One lady said, "Oh, you got to be careful. There's a lot behind that case that not a lot is public, and a lot of it is dirty." And I'm just thinking to myself, well, I already know that there's police corruption involved in this. So the following comments after it was great, because this is one of those dirty, rotten cases that you're just like, what the fuck, cops? Why are you doing this to these poor people? They don't deserve it. None of these women deserved it. All they were trying to do was live and thrive. Yes, they were doing harmful things to their body, but only one in that position can defeat what they are inflicting upon themselves. It's not up to us to force them to get clean. They need to make that decision for themselves. Anywho. Also, if somebody comes at me for that, I have prior working knowledge in the field when it comes to working in sober living, working in a halfway house, working in a rehab. So don't come at me. As I was saying, these police use them in drug training in the area. Also, another thing that is strange as well in regards to the victims of the Jeff Davis 8 is that all the information that they used were on each other. Most of the relatives of the victims believe that also that the police are involved too. So when one woman was being used as an informant, they were basically tattling on another woman that would be a future victim of the Jeff Davis 8. There was a lot of inter-information that was basically being like, she's guilty. So it was implicating another future victim of the Jeff Davis 8. So then it causes another web of what the fuck is happening, because here's one informant, here's another one. One says that, oh yeah, she's guilty, and then bam, here's another one, and this one says she's guilty, and then says that one's guilty, and then it's just a whole web of lies. I mean, we don't know for sure if they're lies or not, but because, I don't have the transcriptions for their case files. I just have my basic knowledge of what I've been able to uncover about this case, and basically my retelling for you. That's what I have. I'm not going to sum it up, serve it on a platter of shiny hot shit and be like, here you go. I have what I have in what I believe. Hence why I'm covering this true crime channel. One of our victims actually witnessed a murder that was committed by a police officer. So this was the shooting death of Leonard Crochet, or Leonard Crotchet. Because this is in Louisiana, a lot of names are French, so you have to be aware of that. Hence why it's either Leonard Crochet or Leonard Crotchet. But the way it's spelled is Crochet. So his murder happened in 2005, and the person that watched this was Kristen Lopez. So Kristen Lopez is victim number 3 that was found, which would make sense as to her seeing him die and then her ultimately dying, because it's tying up a loose end, which is sad, because Kristen Lopez was found on March 18th of 2007, and this man died in 2005. So if they really wanted to keep her along for a little bit, keep using her as an informant, and then we're finally just like, all right, get rid of her, that more than likely, possibly is what happened. Unfortunately for her. Yes. So there is another victim that was killed by the police, and this is a man named Alvin Lewis. So Alvin Lewis is actually Loretta Chason Lewis's brother-in-law. So she is referred to as victim number 1, but that's not the only relation that Alvin Lewis had to a victim of the Jefferson Davis 8. Alvin Lewis fathered a child with Whitney Dubois. So there's a lot of things that kind of tie these murders into other supplemental murders that make the web even worse. So since the initial investigation into these murders, there was a significant amount of mishandling and misconduct when it came to the police actually handling this case. There's many statements in which they've been made in regards to how the case was simply just disposed of by a sergeant, and this sergeant ultimately would be forced to resign from his position for all of those alleged acts of mishandling. And he didn't give a second thought about any of them. He didn't care. To me, that's him trying to cover his ass. He's not covering this case. He wants to cover his ass. Something is clearly wrong with this situation. I digress. There is also another allegation that Warren Gary, who is a chief criminal investigator for Jennings that was on the case, he apparently bought a truck, and with this truck, he then used evidence to dispose of a body so that nothing could be traced back to him. Is that fishy to you or what? Because it's fishy to me. Also very interesting. Anywho, I will say there was DNA samples that were taken from every single investigator in 2009, and these samples then were used to see if they matched any of the trace evidence that they were able to lift off of these victims or any of the crime scenes. But unfortunately any of these results from these tests we will never see. And the reason for this is because the sheriff's office of Jennings is refusing to let them out. They absolutely refuse to release these test results. Why would one do that? More cover-up sparking controversy? I don't know. So, to me, they're trying to save their own ass. So there has been some suspects named in the case of the Jeff Davis 8, and these people are Frankie Richard, Byron Chad Jones, Lawrence Nixon, and Hannah Connor. So in May of 2007, there was 2 arrest warrants that were released, and that was for Frankie Richard and his niece, Hannah Connor. So Frankie Richard is a significant suspect, and this is due to him being the last known person to be seen with each of the Jeff Davis 8 victims. Yes, and he was known to have a sexual relationship with all of them. So these 2, Connor and Richard, were held for months. I'm sorry, if you're being held on an arrest warrant and not fully being served and just being held in the jail, I'm sorry, that doesn't seem right to me. It probably could be right. It probably could just be my brain not fully being able to fathom the idiocracy that is behind this case, but I digress. So, they were held for months, but they ultimately would be released. And this was due to 2 of the victims that apparently initially came forward about them. They ended up recanting their story. And they recanted the information that got Richard and Connor arrested. So, the evidence that the police had that supposedly connected them to the case was then discarded by a police officer. So next we have Byron Jones and Lawrence Nixon. So they were briefly charged in connection to the murder of Ernestine Patterson at the time, around the time of her death, and they were charged with second-degree murder. When I say at the time of her death, I mean it loosely. So, due to the sheriff's office failing to go back to her crime scene and not test anything for 15 months, they had no evidence to tie them to it. I will say this too, Lawrence Nixon is actually the cousin to victim number 5, Laconia Brown. When I said that there is close ties in this case that tie these victims in more ways than one, I mean it. There is so many ways that these victims are related, and they deserve to be talked about. They deserve to have their name known. So Frankie Richard, I will also say he was a local strip club owner, and he is a suspected drug dealer. And he also admitted to having sex with most of these victims while he was addicted to crack. But that, my friends, also, if you wanted to watch more about this case, you can watch Murder in the Bayou, which it is a book, but they've also turned it into a show. I'm pretty sure, I think it's on Hulu, or it might not be on Hulu. I don't know. That is written by, so Murder in the Bayou is written by Ethan Brown, the investigative reporter. It's very good. I highly recommend it. There is a podcast series called Behind the Yellow Tape, which is about 12 episodes, and it talks about this case. Investigative Discovery, Death in the Bayou. That's the series that I was thinking of. And then Murder in the Bayou is on Showtime. Apologies about that. And so, also, it's kind of speculated that the Jeff Davis 8 was thought to be the inspiration for True Detective, the HBO series, but that was determined it wasn't, unfortunately. But what are your thoughts? Leave them in the comments down below. I would love to know. And that, my friends, is this week's or this supplemental yes, this supplemental Crimes Untold case with Liz, and I will see you guys in my next one.